Now, we come to the center of the project. If the diagnosis and transition are correct, then Paul's letters should display a coherent relational grammar, one grounded in Genesis 1 and 2, and made visible in new creation in Christ. So in segment 3, the pace slows down. We stop talking about categories and we start watching Paul reason. The first thing to notice is how often Paul returns to Genesis 1 and 2, not as background, not as poetry, but as theological grammar. When Paul speaks about marriage, he quotes Genesis 2, "The two shall become one flesh." When he speaks about the church, he uses creation categories. When he speaks about worship, bodies, honor, and shame, he is concerned with visible correspondence to created relational truth. And that brings us to a category Paul uses repeatedly: image and glory. Paul speaks about image and glory explicitly in places like 1 Corinthians 11 and 2 Corinthians 3-4, and implicitly whenever he speaks about honor, visibility, and what is displayed in Christ. In Paul's usage, image is given, it names identity as received. Glory is displayed. It names how that given identity becomes visible in relational life. This matters because it shifts the focus. Instead of asking who has power, Paul is asking what is being displayed. Instead of asking who controls, he is asking, does this practice correspond to relational truth? That's why Paul cares about embodiment. Not because he's policing externals, but because worship and communal life are public. They either reflect and display redeemed relational reality, or they distort it. Now consider Ephesians 5 because it gives us an unusually clear window into Paul's grammar. The passage begins with a shared posture, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. This is not a command aimed at one subgroup. It is the orientation of the whole community under Christ. From that shared posture, Paul gives differentiated actions shaped by the Christ-church analogy. To husbands, Paul gives one command: love. And he defines love not as authority, but as self-giving action shaped by the cross. Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Paul then expands it, sanctifies, cleanses, nourishes, cherishes. To wives, Paul gives a different command: reverent response. Not the language of obedience, not the language of servant compliance, but the language that fits the analogy. Christ loves, the church responds. This is why Paul does not treat marriage as a role instruction manual. He treats marriage as a visible parable of Christ and the church. Order is preserved by correspondence, not by control. This also clarifies submission. When submission is treated as an action to be demanded, it becomes coercive. But Paul treats submission as posture, the shared stance of believers under Christ. Then within that posture, he gives different actions for different relationships. And that's the same pattern you see again when you move into 1 Corinthians 11. This text is often read as a chain of command, but Paul does not use authority language in the passage. Instead, he uses origin language and glory language. Christ is from God. Man is from Christ. Woman is from man. That is from language, not over language. And Paul immediately qualifies it. Man is also through woman, and all things are from God. That qualification doesn't make sense if Paul's goal is hierarchy. It makes perfect sense if his goal is relational coherence and mutual dependence. So why does Paul raise it? Because worship is visible. It tells a story. What is practiced publicly either reflects and displays relational truth or distorts it. And here the locked line belongs again, because it captures the logic underneath Paul's exhortations. Reception is not the opposite of action. It is the form active, responsible participation takes within relational life. That's why Paul can speak of response, honor, reverence, and glory without reducing those to weakness or inferiority. Segment 3 is therefore not a collection of isolated rulings. It is a demonstration that Paul is reasoning consistently, from creation through Christ, toward the visible life of the new creation community. And once you see that, the modern categories start to look downstream. Paul is working upstream. He is not distributing power. He is restoring relational truth. In the final overview, segment 4, I'll explain the foundations that make this grammar possible: order without hierarchy, origin without inequality, reception without passivity, and visibility as a theological necessity.